welcome back to another video. In this particular video, I will be discussing the current recession that we as Canadians are now entering. As of May 29, 2026, the Canadian government, also known as Canada is the only G7 country which is now currently in recession. We have the highest food prices, the highest cost in order to afford living. And we also have, well, you could say, more freedoms, right? But now, in previous videos, such as the current state of affairs of Canadian politics under Liberal rule, in part 1 and part 2, you might find me place a rather radical statement, which is that the reason Liberals are currently in power is as a result of protecting minority groups such as transgender people. On and on and on. Because essentially what I'm trying to do here is not place entire or speak in hate at this particular point, but I'm simply trying to place this question. If the freedoms for transgender, LGBT, on and on and on, if the freedoms for these particular individuals is not the reason you voted Liberal, then why did you as a voter? It's a good question. Some might say, well, they were legalizing weed. Oh, so welcome to the recession caused by weed then. That's not what caused the recession, because we're actively seeing that marijuana is one of our largest money makers as a Canadian society in today's world. We're literally getting doped up and hoped up under your Liberal rule. And so, here's another question. Is it directly Mark Carney's fault that Canada is currently in recession? Or is it the Liberal rule of Canada over the last, say, 10 years, which has caused this recession today? Well, let's dive into an analysis, shall we? Now, in terms of I believe Justin Trudeau came into power in 2014, 2016-ish, around that area. So we have essentially seen, we have been experiencing a Liberal rule for about a decade. Now, what is a Liberal rule? It's a communist rule. It's a leftist rule. So what happens when you are entirely a leftist country for, say, a decade? Well, in understanding that leftist ideology means, in exchange for my work, I reward others. Whereas capitalism means, in exchange for my work, I am rewarded. So, in this particular communistic leftist ideology, we can actively see a reward for others based on the work that you or I do. Because we're actively going to tax the hell out of your revenue, because we have individuals that are choosing not to work in our Canadian society. And these particular individuals have achieved what is known as a universal-like income. If you choose not to work, you receive universal income. And if you choose to work, you don't receive universal income. But the more you work in order to make more money than the amount given by said universal income, the moment you go above that particular amount, that would result in you being able to afford living in Canada today. The moment you go above this particular amount, we actively see that what the good Canadian Liberal government wants is that if you make more money because you choose to work harder, well, essentially they want people to have equity, equal opportunity of outcome. So whether I choose to work or not, if I increase my working ability, what the Liberal government essentially is creating is a higher tax bracket. And the higher tax bracket in lower class citizens then results in essentially people not being able to afford living. It results in you, whether you choose to work or not, you essentially make the same amount of money. And so, in equity, equal opportunity of outcome, regardless of the starting point, which means if I as an individual have been busting myself as hard as I can in order to get somewhere in life, an individual that just does nothing gets to achieve the same level of success. This is a leftist ideology. Now, in terms of this particular statement, would it be fair to say that it's not just directly the Liberal rule and not directly just Mark Carney, but both included that are at fault resulting in this recession? Because you see, if essentially for 10 years we have been spending, because that's what rewarding others for the work that you or I do. We have a minimal workforce, maximal tax rate, and we essentially are finding out that for those choosing not to work for social programs, environmental causes, on and on and on, we are actively seeing that this is what we are pursuing in the oppression of the rest of society under your Liberal rule. The more I spend money, the less I keep it in my pocket, right? What has Mark Carney essentially been doing this whole time? Well, he's been spending money like crazy. And as having a degree in economics, or being an economic genius, as claimed by Mark Carney, well done. You have just tanked Canada's economy. Now, you're a rather wealthy man, which means you get to live off of a higher success rate. You are a higher class citizen. Yet you do not identify as a Canadian. You identify as a European. And you are specifically the Prime Minister of Canada. Now, if I may place this question, once again, if voting for Liberal rule was not as a result of, say, choosing to vote Liberal for freedoms of a minority group, then why would you vote Liberal? It's a good question. Why vote Liberal at that particular point? Well, we're actively seeing there are certain policies that right-wing folks and left-wing folks disagree on. Now, in knowing this, what are some of these policies? Now, some of you might see me as a rather radical right-wing individual, but this is entirely false. I'm actually more of a central port between right and left wing. In my personal understanding of how economics work, imagine this. Imagine now that under a conservative or Republican rule, a country essentially gets to put money in their pockets. You have an increased revenue, much lower tax rates, if any taxes at this particular point. And because you're making so much more money, your life is better. Now, in knowing that right-wing individuals also, you could say, work harder, we would actively see that right-wing individuals believe in capitalism. In left-wing individuals, or communist individuals, we can actively see that you spend money at this particular point, impoverishing your country at the expense of creating social programs, incentives for what might be those reasons. Where are we sending our money? And is it staying in our country? Well, for one, I would argue we could, just like Elon Musk did, in the idea of finding the root of this particular recession, let's, as a Canadian analysis, let's get Mark Carney's essential spending or liberal spending, and let's find where is the Canadian money going to. You might find it supports certain cases, like sending $3 million here and there. How about $3 million to Uganda in order to create a gender-affirming care facility in Uganda? How about spending $10 million in order to propel certain things in different countries, essentially, which reflect in your liberal ideology? This is what is known as a form of lobbying. It's not benefiting the lives of others, because you're essentially saying, in exchange for this money, you're going to start doing these particular things because I'm providing you with the resources in order for you to do these things. So here's where the beauty of it all sits, right in the middle. If under a conservative or Republican rule, we essentially make money as a country, and if under a liberal rule or a communist rule, we essentially spend money. It's been 10 years of spending money and 10 years of not making money, which has resulted in Canadian economics under the liberal rule of Mark Carney. As of May 29, 2026, our country is officially in recession. So, once again, I ask you, if it is not to specifically give freedoms to a certain minority group, why did you vote liberal? Do you hear that? It's crickets. Because nobody has an answer for this part at this moment anymore. In that particular statement, we are actively finding that we have essentially oppressed a majority of society by pursuing liberal rule, which has further and further and further spent Canadian taxpayer money at increasingly increasingly higher rates. And this has caused the national deficit to not just double under Justin Trudeau's first 4 years as a prime minister. In his next 4 years as a prime minister, once again, the deficit doubled once more. And now we are seeing under Mark Carney, who was supposed to be a complete remake of said government. Well, it sure was, because it was even worse. And yet we maintained the same cabinet members within said government. Do you remember how a year ago we had an election? Because essentially Justin Trudeau said, I'm too much of a loser to rule the country of Canada. the pressure is too much, I can't handle it. So he stepped down and we had an election. Justin Trudeau essentially quit from being the Prime Minister of Canada. Yet he had it pretty good. So let's get into Mark Carney now. Well, the first 8 years of this particular problem were Justin Trudeau. And then we saw him quit because he couldn't take the stress of messing this economy up anymore and being found guilty of this. So, at this particular moment, we might find that Mark Carney essentially, in his running for Prime Minister against a much better leader such as Pierre Poilievre, pardon me, but in understanding that Mark Carney was essentially voted into power by liberal voters, which we are now seeing this particular minority is essentially a majority. And this majority is choosing not to work, leaving the rest of the working folks having to support you on top of our backs because y'all are not carrying your weight in society. Everyone else has to work. Why don't you? Too triggered? Now this is meant to create conversation and might have differing opinions, but in the idea of, say, a great man like Charlie Kirk once said, the moment we stop talking is the moment society begins to die. We might have different opinions, but based on these different opinions, guess what? You can essentially create a more refined mind, you could say. If all you do is agree, and you never have a pushback, you could say participating at this point. Here's your trophy. The moment you don't essentially know the difference between losing and winning, known as success. Once again, under liberal rule, we saw the rise of killing the idea of success. And in this particular moment, over the last 10 plus years now, we have actively seen a huge change. Not just in the spending of Canadian taxpayer money, but we also saw a huge change in an increase in a much smaller group, which over the last 10 years has potentially expanded and essentially exploded in popularity. Why might that be? Well, said minority group does not have to work. They are the highest protected class out of any civilian in our society. I'm not going to go on placing blame here, placing blame here, placing blame here, placing blame here, because ultimately it's not the people's fault that we are in a recession. It's Mark Carney's fault, right? Yet who voted in Mark Carney? Under the Mark Carney administration, we were told we would have a complete remake of said government. Yet every cabinet member of Mark Carney's team is the exact same cabinet member that Justin Trudeau had on his team. Mark Carney, essentially himself, was an individual on Justin Trudeau's team. All he did was essentially go, Justin Trudeau quit, I'm taking a promotion. And I'm going to take big bonuses as a result of this promotion. Hence why, as an example, within first 3 weeks of Mark Carney being Prime Minister of Canada, we see him take a $500,000 trip to Europe to essentially meet with the G7 and have a wicked party. Now, I don't know about the rest of you, but the rest of the G7 is actually rather better off than Canada currently, because we have just entered a recession. Out of every G7 country, under Mark Carney rule, or Mark Carney essentially, sorry Canada, lost it all, don't have anything left in that pocket. We essentially saw the rise that Mark Carney is an irresponsible spender, and him claiming to be an economic genius, while we are actively seeing an act of negligence if that is the case, because if you truly are this economic genius, Mr. Carney, well then you wouldn't have spent the money of taxpayer dollar the way you have over 1 year, resulting in now the recession. What would you say is a cause, or what would you do if an individual is negligent in their practice? Well, in certain countries, as an example, if I, as a doctor, am negligent and purposefully or unpurposefully cause a malpractice, we would essentially see a doctor should know better than that. Now, a doctor is just a doctor, and they are tremendously intelligent people, which means in understanding that a doctor has become a doctor able to heal people or cause care systems and create them, if a doctor cannot do this, we say that is negligent. But what happens when the Prime Minister of Canada is negligent and has essentially resulted in the entire country now having to suffer based on one individual, which we will call the minority? And this minority is our Prime Minister. Now, I don't know about y'all, but if I was Canada right now, I would say screw the Liberal government, screw Mark Carney, get him out of power, get him out of office, because if we keep him in power for 3 more years, this recession's not going to get any better. We need to start making money as a country, not spend it. And all this Mark Carney guy seems to do is just empty Canadian pockets at this particular point, which we as Canadians are left struggling, unable to afford living. The cost of food is the highest it's ever been in Canada. The cost of housing is the highest it's ever been in Canada. The cost of fuel to get to work is the highest it's ever been in Canada. And we see other factors are the highest potential. We are actively seeing their highest rate, resulting in a greater struggle in the majority of Canadian people. Meanwhile, Mr. Carney gets to live lavishly as he keeps spending Canadian taxpayer money. Now, I would actively demand, as a Canadian society, we should actively be saying, sorry, Mr. Carney, that's called negligence. And as a negligent individual, I don't trust you running this country. So, we need to can him, get him elsewhere, and we need to put a smart person into power. Now, some of you might say, well, I don't want to have to vote Conservative. Why wouldn't you vote Conservative at this particular point? If it's not to essentially protect a minority group, giving them their freedoms, which is a result has oppressed the majority of the rest of Canadians, because essentially we are actively finding that the only reason the Liberal rule is still in power is for the freedoms of a certain minority group. And this minority group has become a majority, not working because they're too triggered. And yet these individuals are telling us how success actually works. If you remember in this video, I mentioned that success is knowing the difference between losing and winning. If you can't differentiate the two, you don't know what success is. So once again, under your Liberal rule, here's your participation trophy. You lose. So let's get the winners back in power. Let's get conservatives back in power. And from this point, we're going to start making money as a Canadian economy. We're going to see our lives get better because we're going to be able to afford living once more. We're going to be able to afford housing once more. We're going to be able to afford going to work once more. And we are actively going to have people that want to work because they're going to actively say, I'm responsible for my own success at this particular point. And if I don't succeed, that's nobody else's fault except my own. That's called being lazy. And then the laziness of liberals, which essentially say there needs to be equity, equal opportunity of outcome. Now, in knowing that equal opportunity of outcome doesn't mean that, imagine, if I don't work or you work, the outcome is relatively the same, which means you technically make the same amount of money, whether you receive universal income or an individual that is working, creating the tax revenue for said individuals to live on universal income. The more money you make, the higher they tax you, resulting in essentially the moment you go above the universal income amount, you begin to be deducted in taxes, which results in, even if you work harder, do the best of the best, we essentially see that people that just don't want to do anything, they just want to party, do drugs. Because this is essentially what is a liberal. Would you not agree? Now, in going back to the analysis, the moment we essentially said, if I may retrace this thought, my apologies, I got distracted. The moment we essentially said, based on said minority group, we're going to create freedoms for them, which means the rest of the workers are going to have to provide money for them through working, creating tax revenue, and these universal income people don't have to essentially work. We are spending money, we're not generating it, because less people are choosing to work, and less people are choosing to work, well, essentially there's less taxpayer money being generated until essentially we arrive at May 29, 2026, a recession, where basically there's such a small workforce in Canada that it does not balance its spending. In this particular moment, that is what a recession means. We do not have the workforce to essentially say we can afford paying for all this spending. We have created such a high tax rate, people are choosing not to work, jump on universal income, because you're never going to succeed at this particular point, so why even try? Welcome to communism. This is what is known as Marxist ideology. why even try? Well, if you're not going to win, why even try? You can just be a loser, and apparently you're just as successful. Why even try? And so, as Canadian folks, I would argue and I would invite you to begin conversing amongst yourselves. Why is it that Canada is currently under recession? And should we keep Mark Carney in power as a negligent leader running our entire system, and in his negligence has caused a recession? We need a new government immediately. Now, in terms of where said money is going, it's not going back to taxpayers. We have spent billions of dollars sending money into poor countries, third world countries, to essentially say, let's build a gender-affirming care facility for $3 million in Uganda or Zimbabwe, or let's fund a LGBT further research in a country such as Kazakhstan, for all I know. These are not accurate, but this is literally the way the Liberal government is spending money. We are literally spending money in countries that could care less about your values. They're just taking your money, filling their pockets at the expense of yours getting empty. And this money is not circulating in Canadian economics. Because if it was, we would not have a recession currently. And so, welcome to the recession of Canada. How we choose to move forward from here is entirely dependable upon you as a viewer, as a voter. If you yourself may create a more educated understanding of everything, which means it requires a certain level of critical thinking, which invites the idea of knowing how to think and not what to think. Thank you for the recession, Mr. Carney. Once again, it's the working man that is going to carry your mess up, and in your disregard and disrespect for the working class, calling working class citizens uneducated. And yet these uneducated folks are essentially what allows your country to continue moving forward. It's not government officials that run and operate this country. It's the backs of hardworking men and women that carry this country. And at this particular moment, we need to remake said country. And so, I invite you to start conversing, having conversations, whether they are of opinions that differ from one another, because if we can't have conversations that stimulate a better understanding, because if all I do is agree, what's the point of even talking? You might as well just be talking by yourself as a rambling idiot, and that might be considered a mental illness. If we all agree all of a sudden, why do I even want to talk? If we all agree, we don't have to talk anymore. We just stay quiet, we keep our mouths shut, and we just live our lives according to how the government wants us to live our lives. This is known as communism, a left-wing ideology. It's been made illegal to have an opposing opinion to liberal ideology. And if that's not complete abuse of power to say you no longer have a right to think freely, to speak freely, then where are the rights of Canadian folks if they're not specifically at the freedoms of a particular minority group choosing not to work?